For nearly 1,000 years across the largest empire on earth, mothers took their small daughters, girls of 5, 6, 7 years old, and slowly, deliberately broke their feet. Not in anger, not as punishment, as love, as the single most important thing a mother could do to secure her daughter's future. They bent the toes under, cracked the arch, and bound the whole foot in cloth so tight the bones reshaped forever, until the grown woman could balance on feet just a few inches long. Imagine that for a moment, a mother, weeping perhaps, ignoring her own child's screams, because everything she had ever been taught told her that this pain was the price of a good life. It was called foot binding, and at its height it was practiced by untold millions. It shaped who a woman could marry, where she could go, and what her entire life would look like. And then within a couple of generations it vanished so completely that today it survives only in a handful of very old women and a few pairs of tiny embroidered shoes behind museum glass. This is the story of how a civilization crippled its own daughters in the name of beauty, and how it finally stopped. Like many deep customs, foot binding began not with a law but with a fashion and a story. The tradition traces back roughly 1,000 years to the courts of China around the 10th and 11th centuries, in the era surrounding the fall of the Tang dynasty and the rise of the Song. The most repeated origin tale involves a palace dancer who is said to have bound her feet into the shape of a delicate point to dance upon a lotus flower platform for a ruler, her bound feet moving in a way that entranced the court. The ruler was said to be so captivated that the dancer's tiny pointed feet became the envy of every woman who wished to be admired the way she was admired. Whether or not any single legend is literally true, what historians can trace is a real spread, an aristocratic fashion admired in elite and court circles that slowly seeped outward and downward through Chinese society over the following centuries. What began as a rarefied affectation of dancers and palace women became, by the later dynasties, a near-universal expectation across huge swaths of the Han Chinese population. Fashion, once it attaches itself to status and desire, has a way of becoming law without anyone ever writing it down. The ideal it chased had a name: the Golden Lotus. The most prized foot was tiny and, by the extreme standard, only about 3 inches long, arched so severely that the toes and heel were drawn close together, creating a deep cleft. This was considered the summit of feminine beauty and refinement. A woman's bound feet, hidden inside exquisitely embroidered silk shoes she often made herself, became one of the most intimate and admired features of her body. Poets praised them. Suitors' families inquired about them before a match was made. The size and shape of a girl's feet could determine the quality of the marriage she could make, and marriage in that world determined everything about a woman's security, her status, and her family's honor. A single measurement, taken across the length of a child's foot, could tilt the entire course of her life one way or the other. That is the crucial thing to understand before we flinch. Foot binding was not seen as mutilation by the people who practiced it. It was seen as cultivation, refinement, discipline, the making of a marriageable, respectable woman. A mother who bound her daughter's feet believed she was giving her a future. A mother who refused was, in the logic of the time, condemning her daughter to be seen as coarse, low, and unmarriageable. The cruelty and the love were, agonizingly, the same act. This is what makes the custom so hard to look at honestly. It was sustained generation after generation, overwhelmingly by women, and overwhelmingly by mothers who believed they were doing right by the daughters they loved. We would like to imagine that harm on this scale must have a villain behind it. Here there was none. There were only parents, doing what their world had convinced them was necessary. Here the story becomes hard to hear, and it should be. But the point is understanding, not spectacle. So we'll tell it plainly and then move on. Binding began in early childhood, usually between the ages of about 4 and 7, before the arches of the foot had fully developed. The timing was deliberate. Younger bones bent more willingly, and a child's body could be reshaped in ways an adult's never could. The process was carried out by a mother or grandmother, or sometimes a hired specialist, and it unfolded over years, not days. It was not a single event, but a long, patient campaign against the natural growth of a child's own body. The feet were first soaked to soften them, and the nails cut back to prevent them cutting into the flesh. Then, in the defining and most painful step, all the toes except the big toe were curled under and pressed hard into the sole of the foot. The arch was forced downward and the foot bent until, over time and repeated tightening, the small bones broke and reset in the compressed shape. A long bandage was wound around the foot again and again, pulling everything tighter, and the girl was often made to walk on the newly bound feet so that her own body weight would force the arch to break down. Think about the cruelty hidden inside that detail. The child made to walk so that her own steps would complete what the bandages had begun. The bindings were removed periodically to wash the feet and rewrap them, each time more tightly than before. The pain was severe and lasted for years, and the danger of infection was constant. In the worst cases, infection could turn deadly. Some girls did not survive the custom that was meant to secure their lives. The result in a grown woman was a foot transformed, dramatically shortened, arched, the toes folded beneath. It gave her the swaying, delicate, short-stepped gait that the culture prized as graceful and feminine. It also quietly did something else. something that mattered enormously to the shape of women's lives, and that reveals what the custom was really about beneath the language of beauty. The official story of foot binding was always beauty, but historians who look closely see other forces working underneath, and this is the part that rarely makes it into the neat summary. Bound feet did not only make a woman ornamental, they limited how far and how easily she could walk. A woman with fully bound feet could move about the home and take short journeys, but long-distance independent travel became difficult and painful. In a society deeply concerned with female chastity, family honor, and keeping respectable women within the domestic sphere, this was not merely an accidental side effect. For many families, it aligned neatly with the ideal of the secluded, virtuous woman who did not roam. Bound feet became a visible, physical signal of a woman's confinement to the home and her dependence on her family. A woman could not run, a woman could not wander far, and in a world obsessed with controlling where women went and with whom, that immobility was not a flaw of the custom. For some, it was quietly part of its appeal. Bound feet also advertised status. They suggested a household prosperous enough that its women did not need to labor in the fields, and respectable enough to shelter them. Foot binding also became bound up with virtue and belonging itself. A woman's willingness to endure the pain, and a family's willingness to impose it, signaled discipline, propriety, and conformity to the social order. To have bound feet was to belong to the respectable world. To have big feet, natural feet, became an insult, a mark of the peasant, the servant, the outsider, or certain groups who did not practice binding at all. It's worth noting that the custom was never truly universal. It varied by region, by class, and by ethnic group, and some communities never adopted it. But where it took hold, it fed on itself. The more universal it became among those who wished to be respectable, the more dangerous it became for any individual family to opt out, because a daughter with natural feet risked being unmarriageable, and an unmarried daughter was, for most families, a catastrophe. Every family that bound its daughters made it a little harder for the next family to refuse. Some historians have added an important corrective to the purely tragic picture, and honesty requires including it. Research into the world of bound-footed women has shown that foot binding was also, for the women who lived it, wrapped up in a rich domestic culture, the making of beautiful shoes, the skills passed from mother to daughter, a shared women's world with its own pride and artistry. This does not for a moment excuse the pain inflicted on children, but it helps explain why the custom was so durable and why it was so often defended and sustained by women themselves. It was not simply something done to women by men. It was woven deep into how a whole society understood womanhood, worth, and belonging. And that is exactly why it could not be ended by persuasion one family at a time. It had become a trap that no single family could escape alone. Everyone could see the suffering. Many surely hated it. But as long as marriage prospects depended on bound feet, a loving parent who refused to bind was gambling with their daughter's entire future. The custom survived not because people were monstrous, but because it had become a coordination problem with a child's body at the center of it. No one could safely go first, and so everyone kept going. It could only be broken all at once. The end of foot binding is, in its way, more remarkable than its beginning, because customs this deep almost never die quickly, and this one did. For centuries there had been scattered opposition. Rulers of the Manchu Qing dynasty, whose own women did not bind, issued edicts discouraging or attempting to ban the practice among the general Han population and largely failed. The custom was too entrenched to legislate away. You cannot simply order a civilization to stop wanting what it has been taught to want. Individual scholars and writers had condemned it over the generations, but nothing moved the needle because none of it solved the trap. Then, toward the end of the 19th century and into the early 20th, several forces finally converged. Reformers inside China began to argue that foot binding was crippling not just individual women but the nation itself, that a country could not be strong and modern while half its people were physically disabled by custom. To a generation of modernizers anxious about China's weakness before foreign powers, the practice became a symbol of everything holding the country back. If China was to stand among modern nations, they argued, it could not do so on broken feet. Missionaries and foreign observers also campaigned against it, but the decisive innovation came from activists who understood the coordination trap and attacked it directly. Anti-foot binding societies were formed in which families publicly pledged two things at once: that they would not bind their own daughters' feet, and this was the genius of it, that their sons would be willing to marry women with natural feet. By solving both halves of the marriage problem at the same time, these pledges gave individual families a safe way out. A parent could leave a daughter's feet natural without dooming her marriage prospects, because a whole pool of pledged families had agreed in advance to accept her. The trap had a door after all, but only if enough people agreed to walk through it together. As the old imperial system collapsed and a new republic was declared in the early 20th century, foot binding was formally outlawed, and the reform movement, changing ideas of womanhood, and new patterns of education and work did the rest. In the space of a few decades, a blink against 1,000-year backdrops, the practice collapsed across most of the country. Mothers who had bound their own feet chose not to bind their daughters. Think of what that decision meant. A woman who had suffered the binding herself, who carried its pain in her own body every day, choosing to let the chain end with her. The chain that had passed unbroken from grandmother to daughter for a millennium simply stopped. In some remote areas, the custom lingered longer, and into recent times, a small number of very elderly women with bound feet were still living, the last surviving witnesses to a vanished world. Before we leave this custom, it's worth pausing on the cost that outlasted the binding itself, because for the women who lived it, foot binding was not a childhood ordeal that ended when the bones set. It was a lifelong condition. A bound foot required maintenance for the rest of a woman's life. The bindings were never truly removed. The feet had to be kept wrapped, washed with care, and tended constantly to manage pain, prevent infection, and preserve the shape. Walking remained limited and often painful into old age. Balance was compromised. Falls were a lifelong danger. In the modern era, researchers who studied elderly women with bound feet documented the lasting physical consequences: the altered bones, the reduced mobility, the higher risk of falls and fractures in old age. The custom that had been imposed in childhood to secure a marriage went on shaping a woman's body and her movement across her entire life, long after the reason for it had faded. A decision made for a 5-year-old girl followed her into her 80s. And yet, and this is the part that keeps the story from being a simple tale of victimhood, the women who lived within this custom built a whole world inside it. Foot binding was surrounded by a rich material culture created and sustained by women. The intricate, gorgeous embroidered shoes made by hand and displayed with pride. The knowledge and techniques passed from mother to daughter. The intimate female spaces where all of this happened. Historians who have listened to the voices of bound-footed women themselves have found not only suffering but also craft, community, and a hard-won sense of accomplishment and belonging. None of that erases the pain inflicted on children, but it explains why the women who had endured it so often defended it, and why it could not simply be shamed out of existence. It was not an alien cruelty imposed from outside a woman's world. It was woven into the center of it. To reject foot binding was, for many, to reject a whole understanding of what made a woman worthy, which is exactly why breaking it required rebuilding that understanding from the ground up. Foot binding is one of history's most unsettling lessons because it refuses to let us feel superior. It was not done by villains. It was done overwhelmingly by mothers who loved their daughters, inside a system that had made love and harm impossible to separate, where the most caring thing a parent could do and the most damaging thing a parent could do were the very same act. It shows how a whole civilization can be trapped in a practice everyone can see as cruel, simply because no one can safely be the first to stop. And it shows that such traps can be broken, not by shame alone, and not by decree alone, but by giving people a way out together. The last women in the world with bound feet are very few now, and very old. When they're gone, this 1,000-year custom will exist only in memory, in photographs, and in those tiny embroidered shoes behind museum glass. It deserves to be remembered clearly, not as a curiosity, but as a warning about what we are all capable of calling normal. Because the frightening truth is that every age has its own version of this. Some practice we accept without question, that a future generation will look back on and wonder how we ever allowed it. If you want more of the history that's harder to look at but impossible to forget, subscribe. Every few days we uncover another practice the world moved past and would rather not examine too closely. Because the point of remembering isn't to judge the past, it's to recognize the trap the next time we're standing in one, and to understand that the people caught in it were not so different from us, doing what they believed they had to for the people they loved.